Hello and welcome to my presentation, Ethics versus Artists, Killing Animals in Contemporary Art. My name is Jamie Reinhold, and my faculty sponsor is Joanne Lukish. Outside of an artistic environment, in an everyday setting, the act of a human killing a non-human is reprehensible and perverse. But given the context of the artistic institutions of gallery and museum, killing non-humans as part of performance has been done, and ethics are set aside in the name of artistic expression. A human supremacist cultural attitude provides artists the access to exploit the suffering of non-human animals through killing for art's sake. While small in number, the instances in which artists have been directly responsible for the death of non-humans, in essence reducing the animal to metaphor, do exist. In my paper, I question the rights of artists to prioritize art over ethics, humans over non-humans. While some of the pieces I examine are widely understood as unjustifiably cruel, like Kim Jones's Rat piece or Marco Evaristi's Helena, there has been little to no real consequence for these artists. Still others, such as Huang Yongping's Theater of the World and Damien Hirst's In and Out of Love, are more inclined to be contested by the public, but not necessarily condemned by art institutions. How do we determine what isn't permissible in the contemporary art world? As a disclaimer, due to the nature of this topic, some of the pieces discussed may not be suitable for all audiences, and discretion is advised. Let us first turn our attention to the performance artist Kim Jones. In 1976, Jones was commissioned by the California State University to showcase his one and only performance of Rat Piece. In this performance, Jones became his alter ego, Mudman. He strips in front of a small audience, coating himself in mud, and put on a headpiece. Mudman then unveils a cage holding 3 male rats, proceeded to pour lighter fluid on them, and slowly burned them alive, occasionally adding more fluid onto the tortured animals if the fire became too low. After they had burned to death, Jones removed the Mudman costume and walked away. Even 30 years after this performance, Jones still maintains that the audience could just as well have attempted to intervene and interrupt the piece, though he would not have stopped the performance, and he also would have followed through with the piece had there only been one person in the audience to see it. However, by claiming that the audience had the power to intervene and disrupt the piece violates the unspoken contract between performer and audience. A social norm was being violated in the form of animal torture. The psychological response to witnessing trauma is often fight or freeze. In a performance setting, the audience is expected to freeze. Once an audience member breaks the fourth wall and interacts with the performer, they are no longer part of the audience and become an active participant in the piece rather than witness. After this performance, Jones's only consequence was a conviction of cruelty to animals and was fined $190. Unfortunately, Jones's cruelty in the name of art is not an isolated case. In 2000, Marco Evaristi's exhibit Helena displayed 10 kitchen blenders, each filled with water and a single goldfish in each. All visibly plugged in, Helena was an invitation to the gallery patrons to hold the fate of the goldfish in their hands and choose to either kill or spare the fish. His concept was to show the 3 types of people participating in the art piece: the idiot who pushes the button, the voyeur who loves to watch, and the moralist who will judge the action. This resulted in the deaths of 2 fish. After complaints, the installation was adjusted so that the blenders were no longer connected to power. The exhibition has since been shown a handful of other times at no consequence to Evaristi. Evaristi was reportedly surprised by the backlash and critical response to the piece. In an interview with Antenna, he stated that we are surrounded by problems that are so much more serious that we encounter every evening watching the news. If people find that my use of live goldfish in the art piece is unethical, I would invite them to have a closer look at themselves and the world we live in. Evaristi's response shows a blatant disregard for the lives of the animals he used as metaphor. To say that the public has no right to be critical of his work when there are worse examples of human cruelty at hand within society that deserves more criticism is inherently reductive. Simply because there are other issues that to be attentive to does not mean that criticism of Helena is any less justified. Damien Hirst had an installation at the Tate Modern in 2012 for 23 weeks, which resulted in about 400 butterfly deaths per week, with over 9,000 butterflies dying in total. Art critic Richard Dorment justified the piece using the interpretation that Hearst was calling out the cruelty of a God that gives life gratuitously only to take it mindlessly away. Dr. Martin Warren, chief executive of butterfly conservation, however, voiced his concerns that such blatant disregard for life in the art piece encourages a lack of respect for the environment. The butterflies used, owl and heliconius, generally live in the wild for several months, in opposition to the few days lived out in a windowless room in a museum. Wang Yongping had a piece called Theater of the World, which was showcased several times across the last several decades. It's a wood and metal structure containing a variety of insects and reptiles, essentially set up in a battle royale environment for the animals contained within it. Ping was encouraging visitors to observe the animals as potential fight to the death as a representation for the human conflicts between multiple cultures. While Theater of the World has had several showings, I want to focus specifically on the 2007 exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery. An investigation by the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals discovered that there were minimal amounts of light and heat, no water or food was provided, and there was no place for the animals in the enclosure to hide or rest. The VAG and Ping reportedly obliged to provide better conditions for the animals in the installation, but following a visit from a veterinarian who called the exhibit abysmal, there was a call to remove the tarantulas and scorpions. Claiming that the SPCA was responsible for censorship and disrupting his freedom of expression, Ping removed all animals from the enclosure. Which brings us to discussion about ethics within the art world. In Ted Nanchelli's journal, Animals, Ethics, and the Art World, he claims that there are two ways in which ethics are approached within contemporary art. Interpretation-oriented, in which the majority of the art world is inclined to use, to justify the merit of a contentious art in the name of meaning of the piece. And production-oriented, which seeks to determine the ethical merit of artwork based on the means by which it is produced. Mark Dion, a contemporary artist who works with live animals, has stated that artists working with living organisms must know what they are doing. They must take responsibility for the plant's or animal's welfare. If an organism dies in an exhibition, the viewer should assume the death of to be the intention of the artist. Both Jones and Evaristi attempt to absolve their ethical failings by placing the responsibility and then the blame upon the audience. The animal deaths could have been prevented by their action in the case of Jones or inaction in the case of Evaristi, when in truth the deaths could have been prevented had the pieces never been devised in the first place. Regarding Ping and Hearst, their works are more readily defended by art critics, but each face public criticism in the name of the unethical practices of the execution of their work when held up against the intended messages of the artist. When questioning the ethics behind the use of animals in contemporary art, it is important to also consider the cultural separation of humans from non-human animals. Coined The Great Divide by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel, there has recently been a concerted effort to diminish the species supremacy between humans and non-human animals. Speciesism and human perspective of superiority have resulted in the justification of violence and abuse against animals. Each of the pieces discussed explore the relationship between death and humans in an abusive way by reducing non-humans to medium and metaphor. It's also here that we need to acknowledge that the perspective of superiority over the species is not universal in global culture. Indigenous writer Vanessa Watts explains how colonization has revoked non-human animals' agency and is central to the separation of humans from non-humans, as indigenous cultures do not treat animals this way. Referencing the human origin story from the Bible, she explains how the relationships between animals and non-humans, Eve and the serpent, were illustrated as profane. In fact, communications with nature were taught to be seen as downright dangerous, resulting in the constructions of society in which humans must both be separate from and dominate over nature. With the understanding of the deeply entrenched supremacy over animals, it becomes evident why many Eurocentric contemporary artists are perhaps more inclined to objectify and use animals as medium in a way that disregards the animal's agency and individuality. While certainly not representative of all contemporary artists who work with live animals, it's imperative to look towards the artists who lean towards the darker edges of creative lens. We must interrogate why these controversial pieces continue to stick out and whether we decide to give them artistic merit or condemnation. Thank you for your time with this piece. I really appreciate all of the space that has been given for everybody who's been able to present their work for the UMass Undergrad Research Conference, and I hope that this has given people an additional perspective on the cruelty to animals within contemporary art.